I will go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Joel. I work on the solution engineering team here at Graylog. Our job on solution engineering is to work with our customers and prospective customers around how they use Graylog or how they do use Graylog. That can be architecting their clusters. That can be deciding on what log sources they would bring in, what kind of volumes they would see, down to nitty-gritty details of how exactly they would make things work. Yeah, in my role every day, I am working with Graylog users to understand how we can best utilize Graylog to provide value to them. So what we're going to cover today in our session is we're going to talk about what to feed into your first SIEM. So today you may have nothing. Today you may have a SIEM, but it's not really in a great place. Maybe today you have Graylog, but you use it as a centralized log management platform where you just dump everything, but you're not necessarily getting a lot of value out of it. You're putting everything in there, but are you really getting alerts? Is the data that's in there actionable? Have you thought through all of the data that's in there? All of these kinds of things. So that's what we're going to cover today. As you're starting on this journey, what are the things that we probably should be putting in there in a standard environment, the things that I deal with people every day on what they should bring in, but also we're going to cover how we can look at our sources of data and decide what fits, what doesn't fit as we start to grow from beyond a minimum viable product of what we would consider a SIEM into something that is able to answer all of the questions that we have and matures naturally over time. That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's start off with exactly what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to start with talking about the building blocks. The building blocks are the things that we need to have in place. Obviously, the first of those is a tool. My guess is your tool of choice will be Graylog since you're here. What are the building blocks we need to have in place before we start to feed anything in at all? Next, we'll cover what these rules are that we're going to use to decide what should and shouldn't be fed into Graylog. Then we're actually going to get down to some specifics. We'll talk about different kinds of sources, why we would feed them in, things of that nature. We'll touch a little bit on enrichment, not so much the actual how of enrichment. If you want to dive into that, make sure to check out Chris's talk, Log Wrangling, which is happening later today, where he's going to dive into specifically how you'd go about enriching messages inside Graylog. We're going to touch on more the kinds of information we would use to enrich messages, and then we will wrap all of it up. So that's what we're going to dive into today. I'm going to attempt to leave time at the end for questions. So definitely ask those questions in the chat. If there's times throughout that it makes sense, we may answer them in the middle, or we might save that all for the end. Okay, I think we probably have everyone in here that we should. Let's get down to business. The first thing we're going to talk about is, so what are the building blocks that we need to have in place? Obviously, the first is we need a tool. We've talked about that. That's probably going to be Graylog since you're here, or at least I would hope after this conference you come to the decision that Graylog is that tool of choice. But once we have a tool in place, there's a couple other things we need to make sure we have. The first and one of the critically most important is a way of normalizing your data. And so when I say data normalization, things that may come to mind, maybe we're going to make sure that we're removing all capitalization, things like that. Yeah, some of that will apply. What I'm specifically talking about normalizing is around coming up with a data schema, a schema for the fields that you will use in your SIEM. The reason for this is that when we use shared fields across our data sources, we're able to correlate that data. For example, some vendors will choose to send in a source IP address as SRC IP, SRC underscore IP, source IP. Some of them just call it SRC. They're all different. If we just fed them into our SIEM, if we fed them into Graylog that way, we wouldn't be able to run a search that says, show me everything that came from this IP address, because we're looking at multiple fields. So we want to normalize that down to a single field. Something like source underscore IP, user underscore name, right? Something like that. Now, we do want to make sure that the data inside of those is also normalized. So for a username field, we want to make sure that they're all of the same format. We don't have all of the different kinds of, we can show domain names with the @ symbol. We can show them with slashes. We want to make sure that we've normalized that as well. But as a base, we want to use these same fields. Now, the good news is most of the heavy lifting of that has already been done for you with the Graylog information model. So the Graylog information model is the data schema that we use at Graylog for the content that we produce under Graylog Illuminate. If you were in that session and you saw that, that is using the Graylog information model. Now, if you're not using Illuminate, you can still use the Graylog information model. It's literally just a listing of here's all the fields, here's the description of what you would put in what field, and you're just going to use those field names so that they're always the same. So that's all normalization is, but it is a critically important piece. The next piece here is going to be around timestamps. Having time in your logs be in sync is incredibly important. And that doesn't necessarily just mean that you're using everything in UTC or that you're using network time protocol servers to make sure they're in sync. You need to check for specific devices. Have they been set to be in certain time zones? Is that time zone information being communicated in the log message to Graylog? All of those kinds of things. So just making sure, there's a couple blog posts actually that have been written on Graylog's site around time. It actually is one of these things that sounds very straightforward and very simple, but like most things in logging, because all the vendors have done whatever they want, it's actually something that can be rather tricky. So just make sure that all of those timestamps are in. So that's the stuff we want to make sure we have in place at the very beginning. Next, we want to touch on what are these rules that we're going to use to decide what should be in there or not. Why do we have rules in the first place? Well, we have rules in the first place because we don't want our SIEM to become a dumping ground. We don't want to send necessarily everything in. It sounds like a good idea at first, but why is it not a good idea to bring everything in? It creates a ton of noise, first off. So we're not going to be able to find the things that we actually need to find. Second is, are we going to be able to actually store that amount of data for the time that we need to? Probably not, or at least for a much higher cost, right? So if we're dumping everything in, maybe we make a decision, you know what, we can only keep it for 30 days. Ideally, we'd like to keep it for 90. If we can bring in less information, maybe we can bring it to 90. So if we're only bringing in the information that matters, we can actually keep it for the amount of time that matters. So this is why it's important to be picky about what we bring in, or at least a couple of the reasons. So what are these rules that we're going to use as we go through here to decide, is this information that we want to have in our SIEM? So the first is fairly straightforward, which is, are we going to set up an alarm or an alert directly from these messages? Is there information in the messages that we know that we will absolutely be able to create an event for that will set that off? There's a second piece to this, which is sometimes it may not create the event directly, but it might be part of a correlation of events. So it's a little larger than, if I see this exact message, this is all I need. It might be part of a string. We might be using correlation events to tie multiple things together. But really, is this something that every day the system will be looking for these messages? If yes, then we're going to need them there. The second is this something that we're going to use regularly? Do we need to run reports on it that we send off to management? Are we using this every day? Is there the user investigation dashboard that's inside of Graylog Illuminate? Is our help desk team using that every single day to find why accounts are being locked out or doing some kinds of investigations? All of those kinds of things. The other part that comes into this is The other part that comes into this is there information that we know, we don't use it regularly, but we know if something happened, it will 100% be asked for. A way I think about this, is there information that I would look like an idiot if I couldn't produce it when I was asked for it after an incident occurred? And if you're like, you know what, no one's ever going to ask for this, it's really not important, don't put it in there. If you do think it, definitely make sure you write up a kind of a use case around it, why you're doing it. But that's the kind of things that we're thinking of here. Can we think of an actual use case for this, either ongoing or something that we would need after a large incident that we need to have in there? Then, are any of these things that we're bringing in going to enrich any of the other pieces of information we've already brought in? We'll talk about enrichment separately in a little bit. And lastly, is it something that's required by regulation? If it's something that's required by regulation, it's required. We follow the rule. We do what we need to do. It needs to be in there. End of story. That one is actually relatively straightforward. That's the rules we're going to use as we go through this to decide what is the information we actually want to bring into our tool like Graylog so that we can use it in a security use case for investigations, for tracking, all of those kinds of things. Let's get into some of these actual things. We'll start with the big one, and the big one is authentication. Authentication can come from lots of places, but let's take a step back first and look at some of the things that we need to be able to answer with this data. When it comes to authentication, we need to know, who are these users? Are they who they say they are? Least privilege, right? Is this account, do they actually need access to the things that they have access to, and can we check on that? Are they accessing things from the right locations at the right times? All of those kinds of things. More indicators of, is this account doing anything nefarious? And then also, has this account's rights been altered? Looking at what group changes have happened with this user. Have they been created recently? Was it created and then it was elevated? And can we follow the paper trail with that? Or someone has left. Has the account been properly shut down? Were there any steps there that were missed? All of these kinds of things around authentication generally will apply to almost everyone, especially in smaller situations. And so we need to be able to answer these questions. Now, what are we going to use to be able to answer them? For authentication, the big ones are pretty straightforward. We're probably going to get this information from our domain controllers if we have them, from Azure Active Directory, an ID, something like that. The good news for most of these sources is that the information should come in a fairly structured way. So unlike some things we'll look at in the networking category later on, where they have a tendency for being really gnarly log messages that have no form or function to them at all, and we have to figure out what's inside of them, the information we're going to get from these sources is pretty easy to digest by Graylog. It will probably come in, it's already parsed, it's already in fields. Now, we may need to take this information and convert it into our data schema. The field names may not necessarily match up, but it should come in some kind of structured format. If we're bringing it in with domain controllers and we're using WinLogBeat or NXLog, it's going to come in structured. From Azure, it's going to come in structured. Most of these things will give us structured data, which makes it really easy to ingest that data in and have it all as this central part. You may need to turn on some additional functions around auditing. So on your domain controllers, you may want to turn on some additional auditing to get the group changes and all of that kind of information coming in, but it is incredibly valuable. So it's definitely worth doing that. So I'd say on the authentication piece, let's make sure we're bringing in every time someone's authenticated, obviously. So that will apply to all of the devices you bring in. So even as we look at things in networking, obviously there'll be authentication events happening there. What we're talking about in this stage is really the sources of the investigation of the truth. And this is your domain controllers, those central authentication providers, which is the only place we can get information like group membership changes and all those kinds of things. That's what we want to get from there. The next thing we want to talk about is our endpoints. Now, endpoints can be a really tricky one. It can become something that can become unmanageable if we don't do it in the proper way. And that's just because of the scale. Because we may have hundreds and hundreds of workstations, the question is really, do we need to be monitoring everything that's happening on those workstations? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Let's dive in and see what we need to think about when we make that decision. The things we want to be able to answer about our endpoints. First of all, is the endpoint healthy? This is a very easy thing to alert on. Things are going on in the endpoint that we think are nefarious. That's something we definitely want to know about right away. Now, the details of actually what we're looking for, that is a completely different story. That is not something that's simple, but in some cases, it may be, right? Certain things are absolutely red flags, and we're going to be able to look at those on day one. We want to look at the health of the endpoint. We need to be able to know if that endpoint has been altered. Again, this may be something if we see an alteration of a certain thing, we see a new application that was installed, we want to know right away when that happened. And then lastly, we need to keep the full history of that when we do need to go back and do an investigation. Now, this is where it really comes down to what are you going to bite off at the beginning for the scale of endpoints that you're going to monitor. You're definitely going to want to start with the crown jewels. So, things like your domain controllers, you want to be monitoring everything that's happening on those. All of those crown jewel servers, possibly the entire data center, right? All of your servers running inside of your data centers. Those are the things that you want to start with. And then maybe you move out from there. Now, one thing about this is there are some ways that we can cheat at what we're collecting, which may make this less complex. When we actually look at what we're going to collect, obviously, the best case scenario may be to just collect the direct machine event logs, pulling stuff in from the Windows event logs, pulling stuff in straight from our Linux devices, those kinds of things. However, they're deploying an agent out to 600 workstations to collect all of those logs. How are we going to ship them back? Are they always online to ship them in real time? How are we handling all that? It can get complex. If we don't need that level, then maybe there are some shortcuts we can take. And those shortcuts may be around some things we can get from endpoint protection. Maybe we're running MDM on some of these devices. In a lot of cases now, endpoint protection and MDM is doing some amount of log collection and centralization already. If you're using a cloud endpoint protection product, there's a very good chance instead of having to get the logs from every single device, we can just connect to the cloud end of that equation and pull the fire hose of all the logs. Now, when I say fire hose, I will bring up one thing to keep in mind. You always have control in Graylog of what messages you choose to keep or not. We don't always have the control at the source of what those messages are, right? In some cases, yeah, we can set and say, I only want to send this event ID, right? Something like running WinLogBeat on a Windows machine, we can control very finite what gets sent and what doesn't. But in other cases, we may not, right? In the case of using endpoint protection in the cloud, we may have send the logs, don't send the logs, and that's our only choice. You always have that control in Graylog pipelines to decide what you want to keep. And it's okay to get rid of some of this stuff that you know you're not going to need. You can always start collecting it later. Now, you obviously can't go back in time, but you don't have to accept everything just because it shows up on the doorstep of your Graylog environment. That's endpoint and the things that we generally see as collecting from that. Obviously, we will cover some questions at the end. So if you have specifics on any of this, definitely shoot that in the chat. We can cover that at the end. Next, we're going to talk about our network. What is the things that our network is going to tell us? Our network is going to tell us who was talking to who, which is incredibly important. As a start, you may not necessarily cover your internal east-west traffic, but definitely how is the internet talking to us? How are we talking to the internet is something that we need to be able to answer these questions for. Things like, were their devices communicating with known bad actors? Was there unusual data being transferred outside the network? Was there unusual data being transferred into the network, between zones of the network if you have that kind of monitoring set up? And then lastly, what was going on with the VPNs? Obviously, that is a huge part of our network now, is that we're not all in one building where everything, just by looking at the LAN, we can figure out what's going on. No, we have people coming in from all over the place, and we need to be able to correlate this information back. We'll talk a little bit when we talk about enrichment about how we can bring VPN into that. But at a really high level, what it comes back to is we need to be able to figure out, if we have a log that only shows us an IP address, who that was at that time that was using that IP. And so VPN plays a critically important part in that. Now, networking traffic is the default thing on that is going to be firewalls are absolutely the most noisy thing that I see every single day. And so I think this is the one that we need to be the most careful with. I have seen a firewall which properly tuned produces 5 gigs of logs a day. Unproperly tuned, it produced 120 gigs of logs per day. That's a pretty big difference. And that 120, the 115 gig difference, there was no value in those logs. They were mostly denied firewall rules. Unless I'm specifically looking for something, stuff that didn't come in is probably not anywhere near the top of my priority list. And that's a huge difference. Firewalls, there is incredibly important information there that we want to capture, but take your time with this one. Understand what you're capturing it, why you're capturing it. These can be rather tricky depending on the vendor to parse the logs for. Now, if you're using Graylog Illuminate, good news, we've done most of that heavy lifting for especially most of the really nasty ones. But it really depends. Some of them, it's quite nice. Some of them, those logs are going to come in. They're going to be in key value pairs. We can throw a pipeline rule for key value pairs at it. It's going to solve it all right away. Others, yeah, we're going to get into regex and we're going to do it. I will tell you at the end of the day, it is absolutely worth it. But your firewalls and your network devices will probably be your number one pain point for bringing things in. There's just so much data there. This is the part that we're probably going to spend the most time on as we actually go through this process of deciding what we want to bring in. Next thing we want to cover is externally facing services. Ideally, you have none of these, but I highly doubt that's true. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about externally facing services is anything which is we're providing a web app that is available on the internet or some variation of that. Things are not inside our network. This doesn't necessarily mean it's being provided to the public. It might be a public site. It might be an employee site, but it is being provided to the general internet, which brings with it a whole bunch of additional problems because although we have protections in front of it, there's so many other things we need to worry about. So what do we need to worry about with external services? So we need to worry about who is accessing those services. So back to users, but also being port scanned and all of those kinds of things. Again, was there unusual traffic patterns? And ideally, are we able to answer the question of if there was a vulnerability that was known in the application or the service, could we go back in time and see if that was exploited? Sometimes this is easier than other times, but for example, in a certain exploit, a certain URL would have been hit to trigger the exploit because that's where the exploit lived. Do we have the information in the logs to go back and see, was that hit? Who was it done by? When did it happen? And then start to be able to chain from there what actually happened. But it gives us a starting point. If we don't have that information, that's much harder to do. Where are we going to get this from? Really going to depend on what you're doing. In this case, I'm not talking about necessarily hosted, like fully hosted SaaS applications. Some of them may give you some logs. Ideally, they are responsible for the security of those systems. There is some risk you can put onto them. I'm mostly talking about things we're running in our own data centers under our full own control that we need to worry about here. Where are we going to get the information from? Web servers, Apache, Nginx, IIS, all of that kind of stuff. There is pretty decent logging that can come out of those. If we're running anything in front of those, a reverse proxy, a WAF, something like that, we want to make sure that we're bringing that in as well. Again, just something to think about of, are you covering all of the bases on these, especially because they are externally facing. They have a lot less layers of protection than some other areas of our network. This is my favorite slide of the day because I didn't change it from saying network, and I had to submit my slides a week ago, noticed immediately after I submitted it, and I've known for a week that this slide was coming, and then it had a typo on it and that there was nothing I could do about it. So I'm glad this slide is over. We can move on to the rest of our slides and I can get on with my life now. Okay. Cloud applications. What I'm talking about specifically here is your standard line of business cloud apps. Obviously, there's a ton of things we could talk about, all the kinds of cloud apps that there is, but we're talking about things like Office 360, Google Workspaces, all of those kinds of things that we all use, because hopefully we've been able to replace the headache that is our Exchange servers with the headache that is Office 365. Tiny upgrade there. I never really got to do that. Unfortunately, almost all of the time that I was a sysadmin, I got to deal with Exchange 2003 and all of the fun that brought with it, and then moving on from that. So what do we need to be able to answer with these kind of applications? Probably everything that we've already talked about. Because they are so wide and cover so many things, we have all of the same questions that come out of there, but in our cloud environment. Now, the good news on this is that it is relatively, although I will give a couple caveats, easy to collect this information. All of the vendors who are worth anything will provide you with somewhat decent logging. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of cases where we've learned Microsoft wasn't necessarily giving everybody everything and it's all changing and whatever, but it is easy in the fact that it is generally going to be one fire hose of data. The data will generally be classified. It will come in with field names, everything attached to it. It's going to come in JSON or something like that. That's really easy to parse. All we need to do is convert that into our information model, our schema, and we're good to go. I have seen logs coming in from Microsoft 365, which every log message has different fields. If we're taking all of that and we're dumping it into an index, by default, an indexing Graylog can only hold 1,000 distinct fields. I have absolutely seen indexes where if you push a lot of different information coming out of 365 into a single index, that index can reach that 1,000 maximum, and then we have problems. So we do need to plan. Do we want to route this into different streams? Do we want to place it in different indexes? All of these kinds of things are things we need to keep in mind as we bring in this data, because it is so much different data that's coming all from one source. So we may need to do some routing on that. But generally, fairly straightforward to go ahead and bring that data in. Okay, now for an easy one. Compliance. Compliance is not easy, but it's easy because a lot of the thinking about this has been taken from us and placed into documentation. Now, I'm not going to claim that it's easy to understand what this documentation says. However, it's fairly straightforward in the fact that we need to collect what they say to collect. We don't really need to care why. We don't have to have a specific use for it. We have to do it because we have to do it. There's no questions specifically we need to be able to answer, except, can you produce this? Yes, here you go. It is produced for you. Definitely make sure you keep that in mind as you're planning this. Are there things which are compliance only? The reason I say compliance only is there's a lot of good stuff actually that the compliance requirements will tell you to keep that you really should keep and you do have a use for. So the ideal is that we have very little data which is not being actively used by us, but is required by compliance. Now, when it comes to something like retention, that may be a different story. If we have to keep everything for 7 years, are we really going back on a daily basis and looking at stuff from 7 years ago? Probably not. But for a lot of this, I would hope you have a lot of overlap between compliance and what you're actually using. It is a good measuring stick to measure yourself against, but something to keep in mind as we're deciding what we need to bring in there. That brings us to an end of the specific things that we need to bring in, except for one last thing, which is around enrichment. As I said, enrichment is the information that we need to bring into the system that we're going to use to tie into the other messages we're getting to make those messages more valuable. This may mean that there's information in the messages for us to make a determination more quickly on what's actually going on, or it may mean that we are able to actually get the full picture, and without it, we couldn't. So what do I mean by that? As I said, we're going to talk about DHCP. We'll dive a little deeper into DHCP in a second and why we need to bring that in. But DHCP is something that I would say is required to be brought in. Now, DHCP is a little different from the other things in this list in that that actually is another stream of messages. You are collecting the information on your domain controllers. If you're in a small environment, there's a good chance those domain controllers are also providing your DHCP. Easy place to pick that up. Maybe it's coming from somewhere else. We need to make sure we're grabbing it from there as well, feeding that information in. So we need it. We'll talk about why we need it in a second, but I promise you, I feel very strongly that DHCP is something that you absolutely should be feeding into your system, and we'll get into why in a sec. The other kinds of enrichment we can do, though, are not necessarily a stream of data. These are more lookups that we're doing inside of pipeline rules as the other messages are flowing through. If we have messages that contain external IP addresses, we could go ahead and add GUIP information to that. That information can be helpful. I will tell you that information is very helpful to make very nice maps that we all know that the higher ups love to look at. For that alone, it may be worth adding the GUIP information, but there is really usable data inside of there around getting that bigger picture first of, is this normal? Is this not normal? Are these IP addresses in our town? And yeah, that is our staff VPNing in, or most likely it is, versus they're on the other side of the world. What's going on here? We're able to figure that out really quickly by having that information. The other kind of bucket for that would be, can we add threat intelligence information to this? So what is the health of this IP address? Has it been flagged somewhere as being nefarious? Even very light information like, is this IP address classified as being a residential user? It's used in the data center, these kinds of things. Being able to add all of this information really helps us get that full picture as we're looking at the messages of what's going on. Now, as I promised, let's dive into DHCP. Why is DHCP so important? There are a lot of messages that we will have in Graylog which only contain IP addresses as the only thing we can correlate that back to. Obviously, over time, with dynamic addresses, who has that address will change. And most likely, we are not looking at a message where that machine still has that same IP address today that it did at the time that this happened. So we need to be able to go back and correlate that together. At a minimum, that means let's find this message. We have the ability to grab the IP address, grab the time, go and look in that other stream of data for our DHCP events and see what information is going on there. Now, the ideal with this is that we wouldn't have to do that. And right here, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of what's going to be in Graylog 5.2, specifically in Graylog security, is around an asset model and tying information to actual machines and tracking this over time. So this is going to take this information and it's going to make it very easy. So when I'm looking at a message here inside of Graylog, I'm going to see the asset that had that IP at that time. We're going to use the DHCP logs for this. So this is where you can see how, in a fully fleshed out solution, this is why those DHCP messages are so important, is that it allows us to make that correlation. Now, all of a sudden, we can jump back and see exactly what this machine was. We can immediately pivot and start investigating what was happening on that machine at that time. So that's DHCP, why it's so important, and why I feel so strongly that we have to have it. Without it, we can't necessarily attribute things that are going on to our network to specific devices. If we can't do that, we can't complete the remaining steps of the investigation. All right, we are almost to the end. I will answer questions when we get to the end. I'm going to have to, because I can't keep talking, because I've been now talking for 40 minutes, and I'm not nearly as young as I used to be. Completely running out of steam. I'm putting myself to sleep, so I'm hoping the rest of you are not getting put to sleep by this. Our final tips. Most important, but least fun tip, documentation. I was a sysadmin for 15 years. In those 15 years, I knew every single day that I needed to document things. Did I do it? Not particularly well. Did I enjoy doing it? Never. Was it super important? Every day it was super important. And it would always come back to bite me when I didn't do it. What does documentation mean specifically to this case in Graylog? Documenting doesn't necessarily have to be something outside Graylog. There's lots of places inside Graylog where we can add descriptions, we can add inline comments inside of our pipeline rules. The reason we want to do this is that by the time we actually need to go and do an investigation, or by the time something breaks, we're probably not going to remember why we did this in the first place. And so having documentation around why you created an alert, what kinds of messages this alert relies on. So if this alert is no longer firing, we can go and we can investigate, are we receiving all the messages that we originally set it up to receive? Or as we want to start growing the information that we're bringing into Graylog, this alert was built for monitoring when there was a failed authentication anywhere inside of our network. Okay, now when I bring something new in, I go, okay, that's an alert that I need to make sure that this new message source that I'm bringing in works with this alert, because this is why we built this. Having that documentation in place so we can understand that is very important. Again, same thing on dashboards. What information actually needs to be there for these dashboards to function? I'm looking at it. It looks like it works, but am I able to go and check that I'm still receiving all of the messages from all of the sources that I was expecting to? And then definitely in pipelines, inline comment, out the yin yang. Why did I do it this way? Make sure you include an example message that you're basing the parsing you built off of. When it stops working, we can go in and we can say, oh, the reason it's not working is because the format changed from the way that it used to be. We look at this new message. This doesn't look like how it used to look when we built this rule. So it's super easy to add it in pipelines. Document the live incarnation of the thing, because you will 100% want that later on. The last tip is creating some alerts around the health of your system. Something like, hey, the logging, we're going to create an alert. Let's think of an alert. We're going to create an alert that if the number of distinct sources that we're receiving information from drops, we want to be alerted to that. Or if the volume that we get from any particular device, we want to be alerted to that. Or if it goes up. I've seen cases where people were notified of something nefarious going on at first just because the volume of logs increased from the normal. Because if you're under attack, I can guarantee you your firewalls, your API endpoints, all of these things are probably seeing increased traffic. If you're being brute force, you'll see increased traffic, right? All of these kinds of things. So let's set up some really generic alerts to watch for this kind of stuff, just so that we can make sure that the health of everything we've set up continues to go. We don't want to get to a point where we have a incident that happens, we go to get the logs, and we realize, you know what, the logs stopped working 6 months ago, and we never realized it. That's not the time you want to figure that out. It's a very good way to wreck your day. So that is everything I had to cover today. Thank you very much for your time. We'll definitely get into questions in a second. If you have additional questions after the fact, definitely feel free to reach out to me via email, hit me up on LinkedIn, whatever your tool of choice is. Happy to chat about how these things go. Also love to hear long term, 6 months from now, you've gone through this process, you've actually done it. How has that worked out from you? Would love to hear all of those things. Okay, question from the chat. Can we use the Graylog schema as the default schema for fields in different indices? Yes. So the schema in Graylog is not, it's not some hard thing that is applied to an index or to Graylog. It's just using those field names. And we can use those field names between different indexes. So basically, all of it is in practice is as we bring our logs in, we're running them through our pipelines. Are we taking the names of those fields, converting them to the fields that we have and want to use inside of our data schema, and then writing those? The caveat I will give you to this to be careful with is that if you're using the same field name across multiple indexes, make sure that what is in those, and if you're following the GIM, you should be doing this anyway, make sure that the values of those fields are in the same format. Now, having said that, sometimes that's very simple, right? We're going to make sure that we only put numbers and that kind of thing. Where this can get a little tricky is just because it looks like an IP address over here, because Graylog will do some guessing as to the type of data it is, does not mean it's actually stored as a IP address in this index over here. So you do need to make sure that it's being stored as the same data type. So not only does it look the same, is it stored as the same data type across those indexes? Graylog will function without that, but you will not be able to run searches with mixed data types. I actually literally ran into this today when I was doing the CTF. Because I work with the GIM every single day in the CTF, when I had to do the grok exercise, I used GIM field names for my source IP address. Source IP already existed inside of that environment, and I hadn't done the work to properly parse the data into the exact right format. There was a conflict, and I got an error page. I got an error in my search page. So you want to make sure that you're using the GIM. It's not something we're applying. It's not this heavy-handed thing. It's really just more the way we approach the naming of our data and the validation of our data inside Graylog to make sure that we can use it across the board. There was another question around where can we find a list of devices that we support in Illuminate. If you search Google for Graylog Illuminate, there, our documentation site, it goes into exact detail on which products Illuminate covers. For some of them, it will even tell you the exact event IDs that it works with, ones that it doesn't work with, how they all need to be set up, all of that kind of thing. All of the details is on the doc site for everything that we support in a very good level of detail. How can we suppress duplicate logs not to send over other systems? Duplicate logs is a fun one. Log messages are treated as distinct objects inside of Graylog. We can deal with them in processing pipelines, but we need a way of finding that there is a duplicate. We can use things like lookup tables to do that. We can look up and see, is this, we have to make sure that we're able to write the information when it comes in. We received this message. We didn't receive, have we received this message in the past? Be able to look that up. It can get a little tricky. It is easiest to do that at the source for sure. But there are tools in pipelines that allow us to deal with duplicate logging. The easiest way is to not have it happen in the first place. There is stuff inside pipelines. It can get pretty advanced to do it, but there's absolutely ways that it can be done inside pipelines. I've done it before for some services where every time you send a request to their API, they just return all of the logs like that they ever received back to you. And we need to figure out which is which. Okay, question around retention. Let me read it here because it's a little long. So a question specifically around using Docker and setting that up. For a detailed answer to that, definitely hit us up on the community, all on community.greylog.org. I'm not going to be the best person to answer a Docker question for sure, especially not off the top of my head. But all of the solution engineers at Greylog hang out on community.greylog.com. So definitely make sure you are making use of that. And yeah, hit us up there and we can dive into questions around Docker. If we use pipelines of millions of logs, do you suggest to send them to separate and then process? I think I know where you're getting with this because I have dealt with this with some of our customers before. The way that I look at processing messages as they come in is a little bit like a pyramid. We want to do the rough routing first. So something comes in, we want to separate it by whatever the easiest filter we can use is. And when I say easy, I'm talking about computationally easy. Exact matches on it came from this input versus it came from that input. Those kinds of things. We'll use that to break it, to route it to some different streams. Until my kids are home now, it's after school, I'm in Eastern time. So we'll route it into different streams. After we route it into different streams, then... So apparently today I'm having one of those days like that guy on the BBC whose kid came in. So welcome to Grail Go Remote. Sorry. Okay. So we're talking about routing. Rough routing first. So is it like input, stuff like that? Then we can get to what's the specific product. Then we can break it out again. It gets into a deep dive on how pipelines function. But at the highest level, what we want to make sure of is that the pipelines are touching the least amount of messages possible as they flow through, especially as we need to do more and more advanced things to them or more and more advanced filters to them. We want that to happen to the least number possible. So example, we're going to break it out by inputs first because that's easy to do. Then once we look at that, we'll say, okay, now this is, so we're going to say all of the syslog goes this way. Once we look at that, we'll say, okay, is this a Fortinet? Is it a Palo Alto? There's an easy way of telling that based on this one field. Okay, we'll break it apart. You don't want to be running something like a when clause on your pipeline that's using regex on every single message flowing through, right? We want to be doing that on just the tiniest amount possible. And so we'll put that stuff down the bottom of that pyramid as it starts to get broken apart. So hopefully that was helpful. There is a lot that can be done around architecting those at scale, but it definitely does make a huge difference. So thank you very much all for your time. Again, feel free, any other questions, you can hit me up. Feel free to reach out to me on the community.